Hello everyone, and welcome to TERN's 2025 webinar series. And today we're going to be looking at invasive species versus threatened species. So thank you everyone for being here today. We're very excited to have you join us from both across Australia and across the world. We've got quite a few international registrants. I think we counted about 7 countries in the last count. And just to start the day, I'll just get my advancement worked out there. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians throughout Australia and New Zealand and all nations. We're really proud to be building on and partnering with our first environmental scientists, benefiting from their profound connections to land and water and biodiversity and culture. And as such, we pay our respects to their elders, past and present and emerging, and acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people continue to play within our community. And today I'm joining you from Tjubilgai land in the wet tropics of Australia. So feel free to put your location in the chat, whether it's in Australia or somewhere else in the world. So again, thank you for joining us today. And for those that haven't met me, my name is Beryl Morris, and I'm the director of TERN, Australia's Ecosystem Observatory. And just telling you a little bit about TERN, we are a national research infrastructure. We are funded by the Australian government, and our role is to make observations and collect data and aggregate data from other people, collect physical samples, and we provide all of that information about our land and coastal ecosystems freely to people. And our research infrastructure is defined as the people, the instruments, and the data. And overall, our mission, our vision is to make sure that we're always advancing ecosystem science, not just Australian, but global ecosystem science, and that we contribute to the sustainable management of Australia's environment. And I think that that is well portrayed in the topic that we've got today. But you'll see from this list of logos that are here that TERN is not a single entity. It's actually a federation of all of the universities of Australia and CSIRO and our many international collaborations working together to monitor the country and the changes. And today's speakers, we have a really great lineup for you. And we've sent out the bios on everyone, so I'm not going to take up time in this webinar by going into those, but I will introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Irene Martin-Flores from the University of Adelaide, Taylor Laurie from the University of Queensland, Distinguished Professor Lynn Schwarzkopf from James Cook University, and you'll see that there's a second name there because Lynn is going to be taking off in a plane at some point during the webinar, and Dr. Slade Allen Ankins, postdoctoral fellow from James Cook University, will be finishing off talking to us. I'm going to turn off my video and I'm going to invite Iri to start us off in our webinar today. So I'll talk to you a little later when we do the Q&A session. So I'll stop sharing so that you can take over.
Thank you, Beryl, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Irene Martin-Flores. I am an invasion scientist working for TERN, Ecosystem Surveillance. So I'm going to focus more on the invasive component of this webinar today. Biodiversity is currently threatened by many different components. Among the most well-known ones by society are pollution, climate change, land use change and habitat fragmentation, and biological invasions or the introduction of species facilitated by human actions. There are 3 main drivers of biological invasions that are predicted to significantly affect future impacts of alien species on biodiversity. In order of importance are trade and transport, climate change, and socioeconomic development. All 3 of them are expected to keep increasing over time. That is so that established alien species are expected to increase by 36% from 2005 to 2050, even when we consider the best case scenarios. Globally, biological invasions are as costly as many natural hazards. In fact, only one has been identified as being more costly than biological invasions, that are storms. For you to have an idea, when we compare with other hazards, biological invasions are 774% more costly than wildfires and 8% more costly than the damage caused by floodings. In the case of Australia, weeds and pests cost our country around $25 billion a year, and this is expected to get worse. Between 1970 and 2017, Australia spent or incurred losses totaling at least $390 million due to invasive species. Globally, the total reported cost of invasives over that period reached $1.7 trillion. We still need to keep in mind that there are some regions with lower research effort that exhibit rapidly increasing costs compared to the regions that are historically at the forefront of invasion monitoring. Biological invasions are by far the main threat to Australian threatened taxa. 4 in every 5 Australian threatened species are at risk due to invaders. In this image, we have the threats on the first column and then the percentage of the threatened species affected by them and split by groups. So we see that invasive species affect 82% of all threatened species. And for certain groups, the percentage is even higher. For example, they affect 94% of the threatened vertebrates and 100% of the threatened amphibians. Invasive species have already been involved in the extinction of at least 45 unique Australian species. When we compare threatened versus invasive species, we realize how important it is to have a standardized classification. Threatened species are classified following standard international terminology and guidelines that are widely accepted. That is not the case for invasion science. Invasion terminology and classification is unclear, with loaded language, multiple meanings, and it often lacks consensus. To illustrate this problem, I designed this image that I like calling the Invasion Sciences Tower of Babel. Much like the myth of the Tower of Babel, where humanity was unable to complete the construction of a tower to reach the heavens because of speaking different languages, invasion science is built on diverse terminologies and frameworks, often leading to confusion and miscommunication. But how many terms are we talking about? In fact, there are a total of 64 terms used to describe or classify non-native species. This is the evolution of those terms over time. Every now and then, a term becomes more popular than other, but we can see very marked shift in the terminology at the early 90s. This was triggered by a change in the US policy. They decided to use the term invasive because it was more impactful and more compelling than the milder one, non-indigenous. What complicates things even more is that all these terms are often used indistinctly. Invasive is the one that is the most used nowadays. We also have it in the title of our webinar today. But what do we mean by invasive? Do we even know that? There is still no agreement of that either. So this image represents the evolution of the term invasive over time. There are mainly 2 schools. One that advocates to define invasive based on impact, represented in purple, and another one advocating to define invasive based on spread, represented in blue in the image. And please notice that some of the authors that defend to define invasive by spread deliberately exclude impact from the definition and say that it should be assessed on an independent axis. And as a result of this, certain initiatives try to combine both that are represented in yellow. So what we can see is that invasive is not a binary concept like native, but a multidimensional one. An example in the case of Australia, I tried to combine all the information on non-native plant species for Australia, but then I found that the terminological barriers impede me from doing so. Information on non-native plant species in Australia is contributed independently by 8 different data sources at the state territory level. Those 8 data sources already use 6 different terms to refer to non-native species, including alien, introduced, naturalized, exotic, non-indigenous, and established. Then there are also 2 databases at the national level, Australian Plant Census and the Global Registry of Introduced and Invasive Species. From all of those, only Greece actually classifies species as invasive, none of the other ones, and uses the impact-based definition of it. So with all this information, we try to combine it and unify it into a harmonized terminology framework and a unified data set for plants at the national scale in Australia, the alien flora of Australia. The harmonized framework looks like this. A species is named differently depending on the biogeographic barriers that it overcomes. And at the very end, we have impact assessed separately. And when an invasive species causes a negative impact, we call it harmful invasive. But as you can see, in this framework, invasive is in gray. That is because so far we don't have the information recorded in Australia to classify species as invasive. Why is this? Let's go back to spread and impact. Spread is difficult to detect. Spread combines both spatial and temporal dimensions, so even spread can be ambiguous without clear and quantifiable criteria. When is a spread significant enough for a species to be considered invasive? It is not just about how far or how fast a species moves, it is about context. So the same species can spread at wildly different rates in different places. And what is significant spread depends on the taxa, the characteristics of the population, the ecosystem, or even the moment in time. We cannot set a fixed distance to be considered significant spread because different organisms require different spatial scales. We cannot compare, for example, an invertebrate with a bird. On top of it, natural catastrophes can boost spread in unexpected ways. And to complicate it further, we do not track biological invasions evenly. Thus, a lot of what we know is patchy and biased. So defining invasion by spread is less about ticking boxes and more about reading the full story in the ecosystem. Now let's move to impact. We also need consensus and standardized assessments regarding impact. Within impact, we also have 3 dimensions: ecological, social, and economic. And even the new frameworks have been proposed for certain of them and that are quite standardized, like, for example, the environmental impact classification for alien taxa, or ACAT, for ecological impact, and their counterpart, SACAT, for socioeconomic impacts. We are also not able to integrate all of it. For the social and socio-ecological component, we could use nature's contributions to people framework, and for the economic cost, they are largely covered by the project INVA cost. But we still need to find a way of aggregating them. And we don't know what we don't know. So a non-native species might seem harmless today, but all of a sudden, novel conditions can trigger for it to have major impacts. We cannot really assess the damage of a species based just on today. We need to predict the future impact. We need to track how abundant the species are, how far and fast it's spreading, and take expansion as an early warning. And consider the context, because the same species can have severe negative impacts in one place and positive impacts somewhere else. We need to develop strategies based on good ecological understanding and across ecosystems, not just at isolated hotspots. And this will give us a stronger way to monitor and manage invasive species and protect biodiversity. I have developed this action curve for threatened species based on the one existing for invasive species. We can imagine a population and then starts declining over time. At the beginning, the decline is very slow, the decline in numbers. And in that moment, conservation will be really likely, but it's difficult to detect. Then it starts declining at a higher rate and reaches a tipping point where society is aware it's becoming a problem. But by then, conservation is already difficult. And by the time that we actually manage to have conservation policies in place, it's a bit too late and conservation is unlikely and the cost for it are going to increase considerably. For invasive species, it's the opposite. So a species is introduced at the beginning, and then there is a time lag until we are able to detect it and first record it. Over that period of time, it will be very easy to prevent or eradicate. But then it spreads and increases the abundance in time, and it reaches a point where society is aware it's becoming a problem. But by then, eradication is already difficult. So if we take too long into developing biosecurity measures, eradication is unlikely and only local mitigation would be possible. So these would be the biosecurity strategies depending on when on the action curve we decide to take an action. At the beginning, we can prevent, on early stages, eradicate, but afterwards, only containment, or in the worst case scenario, long-term management and mitigation will be possible. As an example, I can tell you that from all the established and naturalized plant species within an Australian state or territory, currently only less than 5% are being declared. So we don't have the capability to act when it's too late along the curve. That is why it's so important to monitor both threatened and invasive species in a smart way. The most efficient monitoring times for both species is at early stages when the problem is not so obvious yet. Aligning with this, the Australian Academy of Science highlighted the need for a unified national biosecurity data system, and that the timely and accurate identification of invasive species is critical for environmental protection. In turn, we aspire to design an invasive species index to help doing this in 4 stages. First, reaching a terminological consensus to have a strong foundation to refer to biological invasions. For that, we have designed a survey to identify the preferred terms used by different stakeholders following a bottom-up approach. We want to consider spread versus impact-based definitions of invasive, avoid loaded terminology when possible, and allow effective communication and management across different stakeholders. We also want to propose an integrative impact assessment technique, considering both negative and positive impacts, including environmental assessments and socioeconomic ones, and considering context specificity and scale dependency for accurate assessments. With regards to the methodological design, it needs to be robust and accurate and incorporate the complexity of biological invasions. For that, we need to find the best quantitative tools to integrate all dimensions of risk and to be suitable for early stages. Ensure comprehensive data, develop guidelines to track trends and changes over time, and combine different methodological techniques such as rapid monitoring, field surveys, modeling, and citizen science initiatives. And the last step would be predict, test, and implement, so forecast future trends under different scenarios. So link predictions to land use change, to trends under climate change, ensure alignment between the invasive species index and the threatened species index for efficient biosecurity and conservation policies, implement it at a multi-scale level, and start testing it for a given taxa and in one state, and then expand and improve when necessary. And for this presentation, I have deliberately respected the different terms that the different authors chose to use in their publication. So just curious, how many different terms do you think I have used? 12, so approximately 1 per minute. So it is a problem, and I think this is a good way to illustrate it. And to finish, I would like to read this quote from Nicholas Copernicus. To know that we know what we know, and to know that we don't know what we don't know, that is true knowledge. So we don't know a lot of things about biological invasions, and we need to invest more in knowing at the early stages. Please, if you have any questions, feedback, or you want to collaborate, do not hesitate to contact me. And that's all from me. Thank you very much. And the next presenter is Tyler Lowry.
Thanks so much, Erie. Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Laurie, and I'm the Project Manager for the Threatened Species Index here at TERN, based at the University of Queensland. And I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people here in Melbourne. Today, I want to talk to you guys about building indices for a changing Australia. We've got a Threatened Species Index for Australia, but could we also have an Invasive Species Index? What might that look like, and what can we learn from the Threatened Species Index? So first up, I want to quickly summarize what the Threatened Species Index actually is for those who are unfamiliar. What is the Threatened Species Index? So the index aims to be an objective and quantitative index that measures changes in the abundance, in the relative abundance of Australia's threatened and near threatened species. So the index itself is updated and published each year on our data visualization tool, which is pictured up on the side here, and can be accessed on our website if you want to take a closer look. The index is based on over 24,000 monitoring time series that come from all across Australia that we've brought together in a centralised repository. It covers data for 335 species of threatened and near threatened birds, mammals, plants, and frogs. And it's based on a methodology used by the Living Planet Index. So the Living Planet Index looks at vertebrate abundance at a global scale, and is a key indicator used to measure progress towards goals set under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, that method is very transparent and scalable, so much so that we've kind of taken it and applied it to threatened species in Australia. To quickly summarize our headline result for last year, between 1985 and 2021, there was an average 73% decline in the relative abundance of Australia's threatened and near threatened bird, mammal, plant, and frog populations. Now, that's a considerable loss, but quite a powerful number. Before I talk about the challenges we've faced in building the index, I kind of want to explain the type of data we collect. So to build trends over time, we need time series data. And our data requirements can be split up into what we call the 3 Ds. So data type, dependability, and duration. Data type, we're looking for species abundance data or some proxy of abundance. Dependability, abundance needs to be measured at the same site using the same method, and duration, it needs to be measured over at least 2 years. So these are the kinds of minimum requirements for data that can feed into the index. Next up, I kind of want to walk you through what I think an invasive species might look like based on what I know from the Threatened Species Index. So this will look familiar. I've just taken the Threatened Species Index tool, changed the name, and flipped the trend line. I've made this up, obviously, it doesn't exist, but I think the point I'm trying to make here is that at its core, I think there could be a lot of similarities between the Threatened Species Index and an Invasive Species Index. And I think this is the kind of tool we could create and what it might look like, taking into account that kind of 4-stage plan that Erie mentioned in her presentation. It could be an index that measures changes in the abundance of Australia's invasive species. It could be a centralized repository of invasive species monitoring time series. It could cover all major groups, plants, animals, fungi, and microbes. And it could also be based on the Living Planet Index methodology, if that was considered to be fit for purpose. So these are the kinds of questions we'll need to ask if we are to create an invasive species index. And it certainly won't be simple. I think, we need to talk to the invasive species experts, people who understand the complexities like Erie and many others, and combine that with what we know about the TSX and our experience in creating this kind of tool that has been adopted as a key biodiversity indicator for Australia. As I said, I think there will be quite a few similarities between the indices, so I now want to walk you through some of the challenges we've faced in building the TSX and how I think they might apply to an invasive species index. So what challenges does the Threatened Species Index face? We've got nomenclature inconsistencies, taxonomic and spatial data gaps. We've got siloed monitoring and data management, hesitation to share data. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but are definitely the ones I want to talk to you about today. So first up is nomenclature inconsistencies or naming inconsistencies. So the Threatened Species Index brings together, hundreds of different data sets, and harmonizing those data sets can be quite complicated if you have unresolved names, so scientific Latin names, unresolved scientific Latin names, and conflicting statuses. So I'm referring to how threatened a species is considered to be. So critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, etc. To give you an example of some of the inconsistencies we come across for the Threatened Species Index, in Australia, we have a number of taxonomic databases that list all species known to occur in Australia. So for fauna, the leading database is the Australian Faunal Directory. This one species, for example, the Norfolk Island parakeet. Now, the name given to the species by the Australian Fauna Directory is Cyanoramphus cooki, and I'm sure I've butchered that. If we look at some of the conservation statuses applied to this species by different authorities, we see some major inconsistencies. So first up is the EPBC Act. So this is Australia's Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. It uses the same name as the directory and lists the species as endangered. The next authority is the 2020 Action Plan for Australian Birds. This is a book produced by bird experts around Australia. It is definitely considered to be a key source of bird species information and conservation statuses. According to the 2020 Action Plan, the Norfolk Island parakeet is actually still considered to be a subspecies of the red-crowned parakeet, Cyanoramphus novenzelandiae, and is listed as vulnerable. And I can keep going. Hopefully you're all familiar with the IUCN Red List. Due to the nature of the Red List that often provides assessments to the species level, it doesn't recognize the Norfolk Island parakeet as a subspecies or as a separate species, and so it kind of lumps it under the red-crowned parakeet at the species level and is listed as least concern. So now we've got 3 different authorities recognizing 3 different names, each with 3 different conservation statuses. So it's these kinds of inconsistencies that can be an absolute nightmare for us when we're trying to bring these data sets together from different sources and build our trends. And I think, as Iri described well, invasive species can face similar challenges, particularly when it comes to defining what an invasive species is and its impact. But the work that she's done in creating that kind of standardized framework will be super important for building an invasive species index. Next up is taxonomic and spatial gaps. Collecting abundance data can be difficult due to specific species or in particular environments, which means that we're often faced with a bunch of gaps in our data set, and this is certainly the case with the Threatened Species Index. As you can see on the map on the left there, there is a bias towards the more populated areas of the country. Now, that is where most threatened species occur, but there are still gaps even when that is considered, which can definitely affect the representativeness of our trends. In terms of taxonomic gaps, it's clear that when we look at the number of time series in our index for each group, we do see some differences. So the plot on the right there shows that we have a lot more data for birds than we do for mammals or plants. Now, these gaps are driven by a number of factors, and this is no way an exhaustive list, but we have detectability. Is it easy to find and see? Public awareness and bias. I don't know anyone more passionate about a particular species group than the people obsessed with birds. They're very charismatic and people love to go looking for them. And then I also think location. Accessibility is super relevant when it comes to monitoring. And I think invasive species monitoring faces similar issues. To give you an example of that, take these 2 alien species that occur in Australia, the cane toad and the quincunx earthworm. Now, detectability is very high for the cane toads, and for a lot of us, we kind of just need to walk out in our backyard at night. The earthworm, on the other hand, lives underground. It is not so easily found. And in terms of public awareness, we know that cane toads are well known and strongly disliked by the Australian public. As for the earthworm, I think awareness is very low. I would suspect that most don't know it exists, and I know I didn't know it existed when I was looking for this example. So, based on this information on detectability and public awareness, I think it's no surprise that monitoring effort can be quite different for these 2 species. And if we were to create an invasive species index, I would imagine we would have a lot more data on the cane toad than we would the quincunx earthworm. Also contributing to some of the taxonomic and spatial gaps we see in the Threatened Species Index data set are the methods in which we are monitoring these species. And by methods, I'm broadly referring to active monitoring, as in boots on the ground, direct human observation, versus passive monitoring, so things like camera trapping and acoustics. The pie chart on the slide here shows that only around 1% of data submitted to the index is collected, the Threatened Species Index was collected using passive monitoring methods. That's a very small proportion, but I don't think it's surprising. I think if we think back to the start of our data set around 1985 or even before that, boots on the ground is probably how we did most things. But we know that technology is improving every day, and I think there's a huge opportunity for us to tap into that data source from passive monitoring for both threatened and invasive species, which can help us fill some of those gaps I just mentioned. Our next challenge is siloed monitoring and data management. So in Australia, environmental management and therefore monitoring falls mostly, is often primarily the responsibility of individual states and territories, or even specific natural resource management groups. Now, each jurisdiction and each organization might have its own biosecurity and environmental management legislation and their own monitoring programs, which can lead to some huge differences in what is being monitored around Australia and how it's being monitored, and across the borders, but we know that species don't care about our imaginary borders. In collecting data for the Threatened Species Index, we also know that there is no straightforward way for us to access the monitoring data collected in each jurisdiction, or even at a whole organizational level. I think the more we collaborate across jurisdictions and move away from that kind of decentralized approach to monitoring and data management, the more effectively we'll be able to manage our threatened and invasive species. Our last challenge in creating an index is in the hesitation to share data. So this is a huge one for the Threatened Species Index. We find that there is quite a bit of hesitation in the sharing of data, particularly sensitive site location data. I think there's a fear that coordinates might be leaked and there might be a poaching risk. And for our academics, a lot of the time there's hesitation simply because the custodians have yet to publish their own work. Now, these next 2 points are somewhat speculative, but I think they might be relevant to invasive species data. So when it comes to private landholders in particular, I think there may be some hesitancy to share their data for the fear that land use restrictions or control measures might be forced upon them. And if they are already managing their land and collecting that population data, they may be worried of the perceived ineffectiveness of the management efforts and all the work they're doing. It's hard to know how much these concerns will impact data sharing for an invasive species index. But importantly, we know that they are manageable through, communication and data sharing agreements. So I think we can learn a lot from the Threatened Species Index that would be relevant to an invasive species index. But I want to finish up this talk by discussing how I think we can and how we should move towards more linked national biodiversity indices. What I mean by that is that to better understand trends in biodiversity, we need to move beyond isolated trends. If we can bring together the trends for invasive and threatened species, I think we'll have a more holistic view of ecosystem health that will allow us to answer important questions like, are threatened species increasing where invasive species decline? I think logically that makes sense, and we do have evidence that this relationship exists. So, for example, on Macquarie Island, which is a subantarctic island in the southwestern Pacific Ocean, we saw marine bird populations recover after the removal of invasive species from the island. But this is a localized example for a specific species group. Wouldn't it be cool if we could map this at a national scale? Could the upturns and downturns in one trend be explained by the upturns and downtrends in the other? And do those trends make sense together? But I think when we're looking for those kinds of correlations between the trends, we do need to take into account the fact that resolution and timing of these threats and drivers and how they impact the trends are complex. So we know that invasive species aren't the only threat to threatened species. and threats can often be compounding and take a while for a population, take a while to impact a population. So we need to kind of understand all of those different pressures and when they are occurring to really understand what's happening. And I think if we can pick apart those things, we could possibly use one trend as a proxy for another. I think that would be a really cool idea. And we could even use the trends and data to make predictions about future and the trajectories of our species. To overcome some of the challenges I mentioned today, to build an invasive species index and to move towards these linked national indices, I think it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of collaboration, but I think it would be really awesome to see. And that's where I'll finish up. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. We got through the fire alarm situation. Thanks so much. Over to you, Lynn.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Professor Lynn Schwarzkopf, and I work at James Cook University.
Having a few technical
Hello,
problems.
everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. I'm Professor Lynn Schwarzkopf, and I work at James Cook University. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about ecoacoustics, which is the study of environmental sound, and how it can be a powerful tool for detecting both invasive and threatened species, which will help us to address two of the most pressing issues in biodiversity conservation. So why do we want to listen to environments instead of monitoring in a more traditional way? So biodiversity monitoring is completely foundational. It's a basic way that we can understand what's going on with animal populations. But traditional methods like visual surveys and trapping and active surveys are labor intensive and expensive, or they're restricted by weather, terrain, or the cryptic nature of species. So for vocal species, ecoacoustics is a real opportunity as a viable alternative to monitor species, because it captures and analyzes environmental sounds, which allows us to monitor ecosystems continuously and remotely, identifying vocalizing species through their acoustic signatures. So what exactly is ecoacoustics? Ecoacoustics combine ecology and acoustics and informatics to understand ecological processes through sound. Recordings of the environment capture biophony, which are sounds made by animals, like this red-winged blackbird here singing, geophony, which is natural non-biological sounds like rain or wind, and anthrophony, which is human-generated noise like planes, trains, and automobiles. Species, especially birds, frogs, bats, some mammals, and some insects, can be identified by their unique calls. With appropriate analysis, this allows us to detect species presence and monitor populations over time, and even infer some behaviors. The Australian Acoustic Observatory is a continent-wide network of recorders that records sound 24/7. The network has about 64 sites, and each site has 4 recorders. We're intending to use this data to capture the sounds of nature, and we really want to develop this database for monitoring vocal species presence and abundance. And I've given you the website down here if you want to have a look in more detail about the Australian Acoustic Observatory. Ecoacoustics is particularly useful at the extremes of species management. And these are two ends. Basically, invasive species arrive in a habitat and they cause a lot of damage. And so what we want to do in order to control them effectively is to detect them early And ecoacoustic monitoring allows you to detect animals when they're relatively rare. Even invasive species, which can become quite common, you can detect them early, and that is very important when they're still rare. And this ability to detect rare species means that you can detect threatened species because they tend to be rare. And so you can monitor the presence and distribution of these species, which helps guide conservation actions. And you can also evaluate the outcomes of conservation activities. So both invasive species and threatened species can be elusive, they can be nocturnal, they can inhabit inaccessible areas, and most importantly, they can be rare, which are ideal conditions for passive acoustic monitoring when these species are vocal. Invasive amphibians are a great example of invasive species that can be monitored using bioacoustics. The frogs shown here in a row are the Asian black-spined toad, which is not a problem in Australia yet, but is tipped to be the next invasive amphibian in Australia. Cane toads, which are, of course, well known as a biodiversity problem in Australia. Bullfrogs, which are a problem in North America and are spreading rapidly and causing similar problems to the cane toad, but mainly as predators. And the last one are African clawed frogs, which can become extremely numerous in the places where they're introduced and are a real problem for ecosystems where they occur. So ecoacoustic surveys can detect invasive amphibians because males produce calls for breeding. And ecoacoustic surveys can record these calls over large areas, even in remote places, as long as there's a recorder there, which allow researchers to detect breeding hotspots because they can hear the calls of males calling. They can monitor spread into new areas as long as there's a recorder present, and they can evaluate the effectiveness of control efforts, hopefully detecting declines in these species. In northern Australia and even in places like Madagascar, these techniques have been valuable for identifying areas for targeted management. In the case of cane toads and Asian black-spined toads, often just removal. Asian house geckos are another example of a group that are easily detected using acoustics. And we conducted a study on Christmas Island where we detected the calls of Asian house geckos on recorders actually intended for other purposes. And we found that Asian house geckos are much more common in low forest than in high forest on Christmas Island, which could help with control of these species in the future. So the advantages of ecoacoustics for invasive species monitoring is that you have this temporal coverage, so you can have continuous 24/7 monitoring, which allows you to detect species that call only at night or only under certain conditions. So basically, it's like having someone standing there all the time listening for them. You have spatial scalability, so low-cost recorders can be deployed all over the place and left there for months. So that allows you to sample for long periods of time and in a big area. And you have remote accessibility. So it can be useful in inaccessible areas where human presence is either difficult to achieve or disruptive. So as long as you can get there twice, once to put out the recorder and once to collect it again, then you can use this method in those areas. And critically, ecoacoustic data can be archived. And that means that you can have retrospective analysis. If a new invasive species becomes a problem, you can actually look in the data for it, and that might show you that it was present before you even knew it. Okay, I've been talking to you about invasive species and using ecoacoustics to detect invasive species. But what about threatened species? This figure here shows you a map of Australia with every location of the Australian Acoustic Observatory, as shown as a dot here. And you can see the number of vocal threatened species that could potentially be detected at each site. And you see that for many of the locations, you can detect as many as 10 species, and for some it's as many as 40 vocal species. So although the Acoustic Observatory was not designed specifically to detect threatened species, just by virtue of having recorders out there recording 24/7 in a variety of different locations, we could potentially detect a range of different threatened species. We've been looking methodically for these threatened species using AI, and we've found that it is possible to detect a range of threatened species at these sites, even though that was not the original plan when we established the A2O. So, just like we could easily monitor invasive amphibians using ecoacoustics, we can also monitor threatened amphibians using ecoacoustics. And this is a picture of a growling grass frog, which is an example of a threatened amphibian in Australia. Lots of amphibians are under threat from climate change, habitat loss, and disease. And frogs are ideal candidates for ecoacoustic monitoring for the same reason that invasive amphibians were ideal candidates. They're highly vocal during breeding. Many species have species-specific calls, and acoustic activity correlates with population abundance and timing of breeding. So you can work out how many are there and when they're breeding or if they're breeding. In tropical Australia, there's other species like the waterfall frog, which is Laturia nonotus, and the tapping frog, which is a range of Todactylus species, have been monitored using autonomous recorders, offering insights into their persistence and calling activity across fragmented rainforest habitats. So ecoacoustics are useful for threatened species as well as for invasive species. The advantages for threatened species monitoring are actually pretty similar to the advantages for invasive species monitoring. But there's some special extra bits. For example, it's non-invasive, which is not something you need to worry about much for invasive species, but it's good for threatened species because there's no handling or stress for the animals for detecting their presence. Like for invasive species, it's continuous and long-term, and so it's helpful for detecting changes over breeding seasons or over years, so you can detect the arrival of these species or increase breeding by such species. And you can detect their presence where traditional surveys fail, which is similar to invasive species, especially for things that are rare, nocturnal, or difficult to survey in particular areas. Ecoacoustics also builds a record of biodiversity over time, so we can detect species that are common now and see the change over time. So you don't need to wait for them to become threatened. You've already got a record of where they are and when they were there, which is crucial for conservation planning. So I've talked a lot about the advantages of ecoacoustics for threatened species and for invasive species. However, I have to admit, ecoacoustics does have some limitations. First of all, species must vocalize. Obviously, silent or very infrequently vocal species can go undetected using this method. It does go undetected using this method. Sometimes people can use clever approaches, for instance, listening for rustling in leaves or particular sounds of footsteps that allows them to find species that are otherwise silent. But right now, we're pretty limited to species that vocalize. If there's overlap in acoustic signatures, it can be quite difficult to distinguish species using acoustics. We often need expert opinion to detect different calls of species. You need very good call libraries and very good algorithms so that you can tell species with similar calls apart. That's not insurmountable, but it is a limitation. And there's data processing bottlenecks, and that's a big problem. You end up with terabytes of audio that require efficient and accurate automated classifiers, which are still being refined, but we're developing AI classifiers that can be developed quickly using very few calls. And that's a real advantage in this environment where we need to monitor things quickly and easily. Nevertheless, as I was just saying, advances in AI and machine learning are rapidly improving the speed and accuracy of species identification. Finally, we have to integrate these techniques into management to get them to be useful. So for them to make a conservation impact, we have to integrate ecoacoustics into biodiversity assessments. People have to be using it. We need to integrate it into biosecurity surveillance. People need to use it for that. And we need to integrate it into more long-term monitoring programs so we have archived data with which we can compare. Automated alerts from acoustic data streams could inform real-time management decisions, such as rapid responses to new invasions or protection of breeding habitats for threatened species if an invasive species arrives, for example. So what we really need is collaborations between ecologists, engineers, and data scientists to unlock this potential for this method, ecoacoustics, to become really viable for detecting threatened species and detecting invasive species. So, in summary, ecoacoustics is more than just a novel method. It has potential to be transformational in our approach for biodiversity monitoring. By listening to ecosystems, we can detect the very first trill of an invasive toad, or hopefully not the last call of a threatened frog. We can uncover more ground more often with less disturbance, and we can gain a deeper understanding of the dynamics shaping biodiversity. As we face accelerating environmental change, ecoacoustics offers us ears in the forest, in the desert, and on the reef, and a powerful tool in the fight to protect what's left of our biodiversity. Thank you very much for listening. The questions will be taken by my postdoc, Slade Allen-Ankins, who has done a lot of the work that I presented here and will be able to answer your questions very effectively.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much to our speakers, and if they can just turn their cameras on and we can start some of the questions. We've had some fabulous questions, and Slade, welcome.
Thank you.
Pick up the questions for Lynn, and the first one that we actually have is for you, and it's so Lynn was pointing out how easy it is to deploy acoustic monitoring in Australia to fill gaps and rapidly do things. The importance of standard monitoring protocols, you know, everyone doing it in the same way to get consistent data. Can you comment on that? Because I know that Taylor and Erie will be fiercely wanting to make sure.
Yeah, there's certainly, you know, a range of devices that people deploy. There's also a range of sort of sampling protocols that people deploy in terms of how much, you know, audio is recording. I think the good thing is that it's getting easier and easier to just record continuously. I'm not sure if Lynn specified directly, but the A2O, you know, is recording continuously. So, you know, we used to sort of just sample, you know, 1 minute an hour or something like that. And obviously when we're talking about some of these species that might be rare in the environment, like threatened species or invasive species, that has obviously a lot of potential to miss them. So I think recording continuously and just having good metadata protocols is definitely important for using them with these AI tools as well.
Excellent. And from Peter Wright, I'm going to ask both Erie and Taylor to tackle this. You first, Erie, but the question that Peter's asked is, which decisions and decision makers are we hoping to be informed by the Invasive Species Index? Perhaps you start, Erie, and then Taylor, you can talk about which ones are picking up on the Threatened Species Index. But over to you, Erie.
I think it needs to be targeted to across all different stakeholders. So from scientists and academics, so that they can base their research in something consistent, but also land managers, policymakers, people working outdoors as well, like gardeners, landscaper, farmers. It's like it actually affects so many people. And of course, the general public, because it's actually something that is there for everyone. And same thing that we need to remove weeds from our own gardens to not make the problem worse. I think everyone should be informed in a consistent and transparent way.
Ayla?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Iri just said. So in terms of the Threatened Species Index, it's adopted by the federal government in a number of different ways. So as I mentioned, it's a key biodiversity indicator for Australia. And I don't see why an invasive species index couldn't also be a key biodiversity indicator for Australia. So I think it's about particularly for the government and decision makers, is giving them that data and that information to make informed decisions that I think are really important. And then in terms of who else I think could be using an invasive species index, I think if we build this huge, really impressive data set, it's going to be a great resource for researchers who have specific questions about invasive species, that they can tap into that data set and answer those really key questions. So I think it's a bit of everyone, as Iri said.
And we've had 3 questions on dingoes. I'm sure that lots of people have got dingoes. They relate around, or summarise around, when is something that expands its territory invasive versus being naturalised. And Slade, I'm also interested to know about dingo vocalization, or whether you pick them any up in your acoustics. So any takers on dingoes?
I'll maybe leave the naturalization thing to the other two, but we certainly do get vocalizations of dingoes, and it's even a species that we're in early stages of trying to develop a robust recognizer for, because we certainly have, their range covers a lot of data that's captured by the observatory. So I think it's definitely a tool that we could use, and we've also had people that are interested in the potential of a call recognizer for early sort of detections as they move into new areas. And
I think Iri, it sort of is in your ballpark with all the nomenclature and different ways of looking upon species. Want to comment on
that? So naturalized species would be considered species that are able to survive and reproduce in a novel area, in an introduced area. So they are still, the population is still increasing, but not necessarily expanding spatially, if that makes sense. But once it spreads significantly enough, it spreads far away, and it's able to establish new populations that also reproduce there, then it's considered invasive.
And there are quite a few questions which I think are too complex to answer in the time that we've got available about, do we let invasives come in and they become the new normal and things like that. I just want everyone to know that we're going to follow up this webinar with a newsletter article in TERN. We've just had so many questions that came in before the webinar, so varied and beyond what our speakers were covering, but we think that we've obviously hit something of great interest to the population. So we will try to cover up, and some of the questions aren't able to be answered in the time that we've got. And just one I'll take this last one. I'm sorry so just too quickly. Slade, invertebrates like meat ants, Myrmecia species, etc. Anyone doing bioacoustics on those?
Not that I'm aware of, but that could be just because it's sort of outside of my wheelhouse. We definitely in our lab focus a lot here on vertebrate species, but definitely people do look at invertebrates. I'm just not familiar with sort of the ant research and whether that's sort of something that's been deployed. But I have seen sort of soil-based acoustic sensors, if you will, that people have been using for various methods. And I also see another question there about sort of shared reference libraries and sort of integrating AI and that sort of thing. And I know there's the Open Ecoacoustics initiative, and there are a lot of platforms being developed out of QUT, such as EcoSounds, which allows people to upload acoustic data for their own projects and sort of share data openly as well between researchers, and also they're sort of integrating those types of machine learning algorithms into that so that people can actually, analyze their own data sets.
Okay. And I think the rest of them will pick up out of session. So sorry, people, but check the newsletter and we'll email some people quite specifically. As I go to my last slide, I just want to pick up on one of Taylor's take-home points, that we can't manage what we're not monitoring. So I think all of these indices and whether they coincide with each other and the technologies that we use, TERN's going to be all over it, trying to fill the gaps. So I'll just show you what's coming up. Here we go. As we finish, thank you everyone for being here today and having such wonderful questions that have led us to the decision to have a newsletter article on the topic. But don't forget, we do this every second month, and next time we see you, we're going to be talking about something that you may not actually know anything about, but we're starting to know a lot about, and that's foundation models. And we want to have a look at how we build an Australian ecosystem foundation model, because that would answer a lot of the questions that came in about AI and ML and things like that. So we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. And I think I just have to finish off with one. Thank you. We'll see you again soon.